G'day! Today I thought I'd make a video to participate in an event called DOScember. DOScember is a collaboration between a number of YouTubers basically celebrating all things MS-DOS during the month of December. I will put some links for the official playlist and the participating channels in the description below. Although I'm not one of the official members participating, I thought I'd make a video anyway. Today we're going to take a look at a machine that is rather special, partly because it was made in Australia and partly also because it's actually quite rare and unusual. It is the Microbyte PC230sx. Unfortunately, I don't actually have a video camera yet, so we'll just have to make do with these still images. This is a picture of the computer here. Notice it's looking a little bit grubby and it's got some writing on it. At some point in the near future I'll probably give it a good clean up. Anyhow, let's take a look on the inside. So this is a pretty simple small mainboard, a non-standard power supply up at the top, a 1.44 megabyte floppy drive and a Seagate hard drive. Taking a closer look at the mainboard, we can see that we've got a 20 MHz 386SX processor. Alongside it are some SIP modules which make up the 2 megabytes of system memory, along with this socket for a 387 and the VLSI chipset. Over on this side of the board we see an empty slot for a Western Digital SCSI controller chip, which is really quite unusual for a 386 computer because I know of very few that actually had onboard SCSI. Also nearby is the IDE port and a Trident VGA chip. The onboard Trident VGA is actually fairly good. It's very compatible and seems to be fast enough for most of the DOS games that I've thrown at this computer. We have a Seagate hard drive installed. It's a model ST3144A, roughly about 120 megabytes. This one's in functional condition and works quite well. When I first got the computer, I didn't know it was installed because it was actually advertised as not having a hard drive, so it was certainly a pleasant surprise finding this here. This memory hiding in the back corner of the main board is some more SIP memory that turns out to be the video RAM for the machine. It has 1 megabyte installed. Here's a larger area towards the rear of the motherboard that shows the PC speaker, the battery, some more of the chipset, the ROM chip, and all of the sort of glue logic floating around at the back. Across the top there is what looks like a header. That's where our riser card would normally plug in to allow you to plug in expansion ISA cards. Unfortunately, I don't have the riser card, so I can't expand my system. So I'm stuck with PC speaker sound, unfortunately, in this case. Just peeking out under the top of the chassis there is the Trident chip. One last thing to note before we take a look at the machine running is these few stickers that I found that seem to indicate that the machine was returned for repair. This one here says that the computer seems to start and then has a problem with the IDE drive. And this one over here seems to indicate that COM1 has failed. The only error that I've actually found is that COM1 doesn't work. Otherwise the machine works normally. Having had a look at the inside of the machine, let's hook it up to my capture system and take a look at what it looks like when you're running it. Alright, I've hooked up my Microbyte system to my Epiphen capture system, which unfortunately has a few glitches when you do the capturing. It doesn't show up on a real screen, but you do see jail bars sometimes, and there's a little bit of noise around the edge of text and stuff from the capture card. I assure you that on the real screen, you don't see anything like that at all. So let's reboot the computer and take a quick look at the BIOS just to see what the settings look like. Okay, so we're taking a look at the BIOS at the moment, and most of the settings are pretty much standard, but there are a few things of note that we should take a closer look at here. For a start, it's got this weird step timing thing for the floppy drives. I'm not entirely sure why that's necessary, as the floppy controller and the BIOS should already have a pretty good idea of what the step rate for these drives should be. So it's a bit weird that you have to set it. Going down a little bit further, we can see we've got the option for setting the number of ST506 drives, and that's basically the number of IDE drives at the moment. And over here you can set the number of SCSI drives. My machine obviously doesn't have the SCSI controller on it, so that can't be used in this case. Going down a bit further, a few other features that you'd normally see. But down here is the definition for the hard drives. And you'll notice that this one actually has the feature for auto-detecting your hard drive. That's quite an unusual feature for a 386 machine, as at the time auto-detect was not really very functional on most computers at the time, and a lot of hard drives would fail. This auto-detect actually works quite well, and I don't have to set up the hard drive even after it loses its settings. Going down a little bit further, we've just got the usual things for telling it how much memory we've got. And these do have to be set manually. I'm not entirely sure why, because the computer should be able to detect how much memory is there. Let's just jump to the next page. The two main useful things here is the bus speed and the slow CPU speed. I think the bus speed is referring to the ISA riser card. I suspect most of the system is actually running at 20 MHz. Either way, this is the maximum that I could set of 10 MHz. With very old ISA cards, the speed you set the bus would be able to affect the operation of the card, so that's why that setting exists. Over here is another very useful setting. This allows me to set what speed the processor will run at when you set it into slow mode. It runs at 20 MHz normally, but if you press Ctrl Alt and plus or minus, like it says there on the screen, you can toggle it into slow or fast mode. Slow mode allows me to basically get this machine to behave much more like a slower 286 machine, or even perhaps something like a PC itself. So we'll just take a look at the megahertz options. We can go down to 5 MHz. Which probably is not too far off the original IBM PC. And obviously we go up from there, up to 10 MHz, and then 20 MHz, which is obviously the fastest speed the computer can do. I find 10 MHz to be a good compromise, because I can use that to do testing on my software, and I can make some old games work better by using it this way. Alright, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run a few benchmarks. We'll take a look at those, and then we'll have a look at some games working on the machine. Okay, the first benchmark we're going to take a look at here is called TopBench. TopBench is a very good benchmarking tool for older PCs where most other benchmarking tools do not work. So let's run it and take a quick look at what the results are. The corruption that like the stripes that you're seeing on your screen are due to the capture card, and they don't turn up on the real monitor. Okay, here we go. So I've got this machine already added into the TopBench database, and you can see it gets a score of 45. Now that doesn't really tell you all that much. It's more the computers that are roughly the same performance that does. So we can see there, just above it, is a Compact Desk Pro running at 25 MHz, a 386 machine. The one before it. And the one after it is a Dell 310. So let's go and have a look at those machines and see roughly where this machine fits in between. Okay, so I've found the Microbyte in the TopBench database, and looking at the two machines on either side of it, we can see where the strengths of this machine are and where some of its weaknesses are. The Compact Desk Pro, above it here, it's actually faster in most scores, but the main thing that slows it down is the video memory. So it must have had a particularly slow graphics card, but it's actually faster on most of the other tests, which I find quite interesting. I do note that the 20 MHz 386sx is not actually all that much slower than the DX25. So that sort of proves that the SX probably wasn't as bad a chip as people used to think. Going down here just to where the Dell is, that one is faster in most aspects, but again, it's the video memory that lets it down. Interestingly, the 3D Games gets pretty much exactly the same score, but I suspect that's because it has the same clock speed. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run the 3D bench, and we'll see how fast it does in terms of frame rate on that benchmark. The main problem I find with these types of benchmarks is that they don't provide you with any context for the score. So this will give us a rating, but without having benchmarked a number of other machines, it's not really going to tell me much about how fast this one is. But we're just running it out of interest to see how fast it actually goes. I'm not sure if 6.6 is a particularly good score, but nevertheless, there it is. Okay, now let's take a look at some games. First up, I took a look at some Cga Games. The Cga Games seem to work fairly well. Pretty much all of the graphic modes and palettes and colours work correctly. The only issue I really noticed with the graphics is that sometimes you get this flickering effect. It happens both in Alley Cat that you're seeing here and Arctic Adventure that I'll try later. The main problem that you have with a computer such as this is the CPU speed. Now, this one fortunately allows you to set a slower CPU speed, such as 5 MHz or 10 MHz, but for some of the really old XT games, even that is too fast. Primarily because the 386 is still quite a bit faster than the 8088, even at nearly the same clock speed. Oh, I'm about to get caught by that dog. Oh, that's no good. I do like that sound effect. Here we are playing Arctic Adventure. You'll notice some of the flickering in the screen transitions, which is a little bit odd, but otherwise the game works pretty much flawlessly. This game is pretty much evil, so I couldn't really play it for all that long. Although, truthfully, this one isn't as bad as Pharaoh's Tomb, which was, frankly, much harder. Here we're taking a look at a game called Catacomb, or Catacomb, depending on where you're from. It's an action dungeon game, so you're pretty much just a wizard going around shooting stuff. But what's important here is that the EGA graphics work quite well on the Trident chip. I have found that this Trident chip isn't always very good with the EGA emulation, so some games do not like the Trident chip at all, and EGA seems to be the worst graphic mode for this. Catacomb plays quite well with the PC speaker and the CPU option, so whatever speed you set the CPU to, it works fairly well. Like Catacomb, Dark Ages also works quite well. Although on this PC it's obviously limited to PC speaker sound, because I can't install an ad-lib card, as it doesn't have a nicer riser card. Obviously this is a bit of a pain in the bum because Dark Ages has some pretty good music, if you have the option to play it, that is. So a possible upgrade for this computer's future would be the LPT to OPL. I think that might be a good option, but I'd have to try it out and see how it goes. The first Duke Nukem also plays exceptionally well. The only thing I've ever noticed as a problem in this game is that it does sometimes suffer from some of the same flicker that the Cga Games did. This game doesn't support ad-lib sound or any other kinds of sound cards, so there's no upgrades required to get the most out of this game. And it's quite fun. It plays extremely well. Hocus Pocus is one of my favourite games from the DOS era, and it plays exceptionally well on the Microbyte computer. Basically, the graphics are flawless on the machine anyway, because the jail bars that you're seeing don't actually turn up on a real monitor. That's purely down to the capture card. It would also obviously benefit from having the LPT to OPL, just for the nice music that you get in the game, although you would still miss out on the sound effects. Not all the games I tried worked all that well. The first Clyde's Adventure here is one of them. I'm not sure why, but it just plays extremely slowly, to the point where it becomes unplayable. You'll get there eventually. The capture for Commander Keen 4, the EGA one, didn't come out quite right. The colour looks awful for some reason. I'm not entirely sure why the capture card didn't work well here. But it's enough to see that, well, the user interface for Commander Keen basically doesn't work at all. The game itself, however, works fine. So if you've got the menus memorised, you can play it. Also note the screen flickering when it transitions from one screen to another. That's reminiscent of the Cga Games we saw earlier. The Cga version of Commander Keen 4, on the other hand, works perfectly fine. The menus all display correctly and the game is smooth and nice. Although it is around about here that I noticed the PC speaker sound did sound a little bit off, but I think it could just be the different type of speaker in this machine. The Microbyte machine has also proven to be very useful in testing my own game, Bob's Fury. We'll see it here running in its 3 different graphics modes, the first one being EGA. I actually used a similar technique to what's used in the various Thexter games to achieve basically a higher colour count than you would normally find in EGA. Basically, I put 2 different EGA colours together to sort of simulate one of the VGA ones. And yeah, I think I've actually used it to better effect than Thexter did, because I've got a much higher colour count. The next graphics mode is the standard VGA graphics. Also works pretty much fine. And lastly I've got Cga graphics support as well, although that one was much more difficult to implement and doesn't look as nice. Finally, I also fired up the GW Basic Interpreter to try out some of my older games to see how well they would run. And they run roughly about as well as on the old machine we originally had when we were children, which was pretty much a very similar speed. Here in the background we've got my version of Digger, and I've also given my other game Jump a go, just to see how well they would both run. And they both run fairly well. So that was a look at the Microbyte 230sx. It turns out that that Trident chip wasn't quite as compatible as I first thought. It pretty much works brilliantly on any CGA and VGA games, but the EGA games seem to be a little bit hit and miss. Those 2 that I tried in particular were bad, but I'm sure that there'll be others out there as well when I have a go with them. The PC speaker sound also is a little bit of a limitation. Not being able to put a sound card in it at all does mean that I can't do as wide a testing when I'm writing software. But I do have another DOS machine to test out sound cards and sound devices, so I can move to that instead if I need to. That's all I have for today. Please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.